This is Fictitious, a podcast about writing and genre storytelling presented by Nerd for a Living. I'm Adrian Buskey. In this episode, I talk with author Vivian Shaw, whose debut novel, Strange Practice, was just released from Orbit Books. Strange Practice introduces Dr. Greta Helsing, a normal human physician working to keep the supernatural community not alive and well in modern-day London. Having inherited her family's specialized medical practice, Greta can barely make ends meet with her treatments for local mummies. But when a sect of murderous monks begins to scour the city's underbelly, intent on killing her unusual friends, she must team up with her undead clients to keep them and the rest of London safe. Filled with fresh twists on classic monsters and imaginative mashups, this new series is a perfect fit for fans of contemporary fantasy. Alongside Greta, the cast includes a highly domesticized Draculian vampire, an immortal demonic accountant, a demoralized yet angsty lunar vampire, and a bemused human museum curator. Strange Practice combines the supernatural mythology of the past with the tools and tribulations of modern day in a story told with wit, whimsy, and a heaping helping of creeping dread. I talk with Vivian Shaw about how the novel progressed over more than a decade from a NaNoWriMo experiment to her first serious foray into publishing. And we also talk about how she honed her writing chops in the world of fanfiction, building a significant audience online that she hopes will follow her into published original works. Vivian, first off, thank you so much for joining us on the Fictitious podcast.
You're very welcome.
So I'm going to say right up at the front here, I'm 125 pages into Strange Practice. I'm far enough in to have a really good idea of what this thing's all about, but also not quite far enough that that my head won't explode if there's spoilers. So I'm throwing that up as a warning right now that we won't dive into anything too much that will ruin anything for anybody. But I'm really enjoying it. I really like the writing style. I like the world. I like the character of Greta Helsing. And really something that drew me to this work initially, we saw the cover reveal come through from Orbit. And immediately I was just struck by, okay, I love the art, so now I need to know what is the story behind this. And, it's always the don't judge a book by its cover, yada, yada. But obviously it has to sell it. And for me, that initial cover really did sell it because it looked interesting. And then I read the description of the story and I was like, the idea of a person who is a physician to the undead and to the members of the supernatural community was really striking and really original. So could you tell us about Strange Practice, both the world and its characters, and then we'll get into kind of how that came about.
Okay, well, the idea is that it's a world very much like our own, and the difference is there are monsters. There are monsters, there are demons, there are angels, all of the mysterious magic things that are in our world stories are actually real in the Greta Helsing world. And she is the daughter of another supernatural physician who had the practice for many years and left it to her. And so she has built up a clientele of supernatural clients, different kinds of clients. She does a lot of work with mummies and vampires, werewolves, were-creatures in general. And she is completely human, and she has no powers whatsoever. But she has built up this clientele because she is trustworthy and she is very good at what she does.
There's something I thought was really interesting, like very up front in the novel. It states categorically that she is completely normal. She has no superpowers. She has no anything. And I really liked that because I felt like that was like right off the top, you saying, look, there's no deus ex, coming along the way. She was the daughter of something all along and has this mysterious power. And because I feel like we get that a lot.
The Mary Sue.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's kind of the overpowered protagonist that ends up being super duper special in the end, the one and only of a certain kind. It's tremendously boring when not done well. I mean, obviously there's lots and lots of great stories that are done well with that, but there's a few books I've put down recently because I would get to that point where like, oh great, it's the character's the most special one ever. Yeah, okay. I really lose interest in that fast. And so having that stated up front made it even more intriguing to me because this is somebody who has to survive on their own wits and also on their extended connections with people within that scene. So reading the initial descriptions, something that surprised me when I got into the book was that there were more POVs than I was kind of expecting, because the initial descriptions, highlight Greta because this is her story and she's the main character of the book. But getting into it really quickly, there are a number of characters, and most of those that we see from their point of view are supernatural in some way, although Cranswell is not. Mm-hmm. Is that something, like, when you put the initial descriptions together, or you talk to the marketing team, like, how do you present that to say, like, this really does follow a number of characters, but there is one main character that these stories follow through on?
Largely that is actually because when I first wrote the book, it was not specifically about Greta Helsing. It was an ensemble cast kind of thing, so it included all of the other characters, which is why the POV shifts between them. And as I rewrote it and rewrote it, I shifted it more into just being about Greta, and I kept the other POVs because I think they added something to the story. I never particularly had a conversation about this with anyone at Orbit, specifically about POV, but I think the evolution of the book kept those in there for a reason, and the rest of the series is also going to be following that same pattern.
It really gives a lot of perspectives on that world, and I really am enjoying seeing from those different eyes too, because it's not often that we get to see from the perspective behind, an aged traditional vampire with Ruthven, or a lunar vampire with Barney, which I think is really interesting. And I like the idea that these are characters that have been around for hundreds of years and live in present day, and there's fiction and stories and things that have been floating around the ether for them forever, and that they're a little testy about the fact that it's not very correct.
Yeah, it's fairly libelous. Like, the majority of the supernatural gothic horror story is loosely based on reality, but not very, very close. For example, Ruthven is really salty about John Polidori's The Vampire. Not only does it put him in a very poor light, he did do some very stupid things back then, but he wasn't as stupid as the character in the book. Also, the taxonomy is wrong. Ruthven is a Draculine vampire, and he is spelled with an I. The vampire with the Y is the lunar sensitive, and that's the kind that Barney the vampire is. And so Ruthven's like, not only did they get the story wrong, but they got the type wrong.
And I can see how that would absolutely, especially in an era where identity is so much in the conversation in our culture, to look and say, okay, there are two different kinds of vampires, at least that we know of right off the top here. They would be sensitive about, like, that's not who I am. That Y is wrong. I could see somebody getting upset.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a moment that really amused me, though. Like I said, I'm about around page 125, and in it, Barney and Ruthven have just sat down with a laptop and are looking at Google Maps.
Uh-huh.
And that scene amused me to no end. And I think it's largely because the tone of the book, it's modern day, but it also has, I don't want to say like a Victorian quality to it, but the language that you use very much has like again, not old world. I don't even know like quite how to pin it down, and maybe you have a phrase for it or a name for specifically the writing style. But it's colorful, it's lyrical. It very much has its own identity, and it feels like something, especially when we're talking about London. And it kind of conjures this old world kind of feel. And yet Greta drives a Mini, and they talk about their laptops, and they're taking the tube. And there's an interesting juxtaposition between that kind of gothic feel, particularly with these vampire characters and whatever the heck Fass is, because I don't know that yet, and yet having the modern technology and living in that world. When you set out to write it, is that just your natural writing style, or were you really thinking about coloring and creating that image with it?
Well, originally I wrote the book in 2004 as a National Novel Writing Month entry. And the conceit at the time was, how many characters from classic vampire lit can I get into a story and still have it be a story and have it set in the modern day? So that's a lot of what ended up in Strange Practice, the version that you're reading. It may seem slightly strange, but it's due to previous iterations of the book and how it developed over time. But I love juxtaposing the historic and the modern, which is why I love the cover so much, because you have the extremely old-fashioned engraving style illustration, and through the windows you can see modern-day London, like really obvious landmarks of modern-day London, like the Eye, the Tower of London, the Thames flood barrier. I love that little detail. But the way the artist, Will Stale, actually mixed that together is kind of like what I was trying to do with the characters and the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, it executes it well, and I love that feel of it. And again, like, you've got a very specific voice, and I particularly appreciate that, probably because just through some of the readings I've done lately, I bounce around and I've read like a few like YA novels, and a lot of them have very plain language, like almost kind of. I don't know. I feel like there's a generation that read The Hunger Games and just set out to write that same kind of very plaintive voice. And it can work in places, but it definitely loses something as it goes along. So a recent novel that I read that this kind of reminds me of, not in subject matter, but in the way with words, is The Night Circus from Aaron it's Morgenstern, I think. And because that's a beautiful novel, and it is set more into period piece, but has that kind of lyrical quality. So, and I've liked that with this. So that makes sense, you talking about going back and it being like a NaNoWriMo novel, and that you were kind of cramming together influences into it. But at what point did you step and go, okay, this isn't a project anymore. This is like, I'm going to, for really real, make this something I'm pursuing hard, and I'm making this like, not a project, but like the novel that I want to get out there?
That's a very good question. I think probably in 2014 was when I first started really revising the original novel that I wrote in 2004. And that was partially because I thought it was good enough to be worth pursuing. And I didn't know where I wanted to take it, but I knew that I was a much better writer in 2014 than I was in 2004 for many reasons. So I thought that it would be worth taking another look at the book and basically stripping it down to the bones and rewriting it from the start. And I wrote that version of it in 2014, and I wrote the next version in 2015, and the version that actually got seen by an agent was the better version of the 2015 iteration of the book. Since like 2014, it's basically been an ongoing project.
Did you ever have the worry that you were sitting on this really great high concept for 10 years? Because, I mean, it seems to happen. Ideas that, we might have, they're like, well, this is really great. Somebody else might come up with the same thing because we're fed by similar reference and interests and backgrounds, I'm always curious about that when you have something that's that strong. Did you had a point of like, if I don't get this out soon, somebody else is going to take this and run with it?
Well, I never actually expected to get published at all. This is my lifelong dream, and it's unbelievably exciting. The entire process of writing this book, writing this series, is just this unfolding series of delights and also stress. But the story, I never actually expected anyone to read it other than my friends. But I wanted to make it the best story I could. And the fact that it did eventually come to the attention of an agent and then to orbit is kind of a stroke of luck in many ways. But I never expected to get it published, so there was never a kind of, I have to get this done before someone else like scoops me on this. There is one thing though. I do have to say that my version that I wrote in 2004 had vampires driving Volvos, and Twilight came out in 2005 as far as I know. So I got there first, but the vampire Volvo thing, I'll give her props for actually like taking that to the next level.
Did you read Twilight and see that and you're like, oh, well, shoot, there goes that one?
No, I didn't read Twilight until actually I'd seen the first movie, and then I thought, okay, fine, I have to go and look at the source material to see if it's like better or worse, whatever. And I don't particularly like the writing in it, but my problem with that is not the writing or the way the vampires are characterized. It's to do with several other character issues in the book. I do really like what she did with the way the vampires kind of integrate themselves into society and try and live as normal people or as close to normal people as possible. And that I see that as like a parallel with mine. I don't see it as like she stole my idea or vice versa. It's like, hey, someone else is doing the same cool thing I'm doing.
There's a lot of dramatic gold to be mined from the idea of taking these supernatural characters and looking at them from the standpoint of people who still want to enjoy life and be kind of normal in as much as they can. We're so used to the idea of a Dracula, Vlad the Impaler style sitting on his throne and being like, really regal or glamorous or gothic or dangerous. I think there's something really interesting about that idea of being around several hundred years and being like, I really kind of just want to have a nice house and kind of hang out and not get killed. Or in the case of a lunar vampire, get killed a lot. and come back repeatedly to feel it again and again and again. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting angle to play with on it, and I'm really glad as I've gotten into the novel that they have those other characters to kind of explore those points of views with. It's really fun, particularly like with Barney having a character who seems to be in conflict of like whether or not he's worthy of life, even as there are these monk-robed people running around London trying to kill off the supernatural creatures from a very righteous kind of standpoint. And, him kind of going, well, the stuff that they said isn't wrong. I am kind of a blight on the earth, and I am sort of unclean and undead, and I do feast on virgins, so that's not cool. But I can't really do anything about that. So it was almost like an existential crisis, except for it's one that has obviously gone through his mind over and over again. So it's dulled to that, like that self-reminder, I'm kind of crap, but I have to move on from that and just keep going. And again, I found that very entertaining.
Yeah, that's Barney. None of the other vampires in the first novel have vampire angst. Barney is the vampire angst character. He does not like being what he is. He is extremely unhappy about being what he is, and yet he still clings to life despite everything. And he has these, like you said, this very well-worn kind of a rut that his mind goes into, which is like, well, everything sucks, I'm terrible, woe, doom, and then he just gets on with it. He's a lot of fun to write.
He also is the one character that like you said, he has the ruts, so he has the sort of the romantic obsession kind of element to him. I couldn't help but think when I was reading about him, I was like, oh, Varney, you would do so well on Tumblr.
That's perfect.
I just had that feeling. I was like, if Barney used a little bit more of the internet, I think like that would be a scene. I could see him being a part of a shipping fandom or something and getting really into it.
Oh, he would be a big name fan. He would have all of the shipping wars, and everyone else would be like, guys, really? Can you get on that? No, that's perfect.
Here at Nerd for a Living, we're all about exploring the ways stories impact our creativity and our lives. We talk about it all the time on our podcasts and in our live panels at events and conventions. And when you turn your fandom into a career, you're giving yourself a way to build a community around the stories that excite you. So we're psyched to be joining writer, editor, and creative community builder Katie Morgan as part of her free virtual event, the Inspired Connections Summit, beginning on August 2nd. We'll be a part of a collection of speakers and experts sharing the importance of stories and how you can use them to build a supportive, inspiring community. The Inspired Connections Summit interview sessions will talk about how stories help us discover who we are and why we're here, how to cultivate happiness in your work and the way you share it, why a good story inspires us to create what happens next, and how authenticity and empathy draw others to you and your work. You can sign up to participate now at inspiredconnectionssummit.com. Don't miss our interview and many more great speakers, all for free, available starting August 2nd at, again, inspiredconnectionssummit.com.
This is your debut novel, and I think that's a really interesting place to have a conversation and kind of finding somebody who's been writing obviously for a long time, but this is your first real shot at it. I went and did the looked at your website, I looked at your Tumblr.
Yeah, it's certainly a thing.
Hey, well, at least it was a well-organized Tumblr. Tumblr scares the hell out of me most of the time. I always make the comparison that to me, it's like if you go to a film about like serial killers and they always have that wall in the room with all the crazy and the pinpoints and their insanity made manifest. To me, that is Tumblr. It is the internet's insanity made manifest. And so trying to find corners of it that seem cohesive can be challenging. But yours was nicely put together, so kudos on that.
Well, you're not wrong, but I have to say that it depends largely on the Tumblr layout that you have. Some blogs are readable, some blogs are just random images and you have no way of scrolling through them, and even if you like the blog, you can't actually follow it because it's way too annoying.
Right, yeah.
It is like the wall-o crazy of the internet.
It's a little much, and it definitely has its own vernacular.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, every social media, it has its idiom, and some of them I get, and some of them are completely lost on me. And, I tried Tumblr, and I kind of got lost in it a little bit. But when I was reading that character, it seemed to really, hit home for me. But when I was reading your stuff on there, one of the things I saw is that you had written fanfic. And, people can't see the face you made whenever I use that phrase. And so I don't know if that's the chagrin face or he said the dreaded fanfic word. But you had stuff for Star Wars and Mad Max and, some other things on there. And I think that's interesting because that's really a training ground for people as they're discovering their voice, playing in other sandboxes and, in order to kind of get your chops and then developing into your own thing. And obviously there's been a lot of really big breakout successes of people who have kind of started that route and then moved on. Sometimes it is very clear their influences, where they're very clearly aping somebody else, or even as they put out their own properties, and they shall not be named here, but I think people will know what I'm talking about. So, how did you kind of work your way through fanfic? I think you even have like a fanfic pseudonym.
Yeah, my pseudonym on Archive of Our Own, AO3, is Cold Hope, one word. And I've been writing fanfic probably since about 2002. I started with Harry Potter, like most people did. And I went through so many different fandoms. I still go through cycles of them. Like, I'll be really into something, and then I'll kind of ease off. And then a year and a half later, I'll be, like, right back into it again. But I went through so many different fandoms, and I learned exactly so much through writing fanfic. I think it is one of the most important ways you can teach yourself to be a writer. You can also get instant feedback. Whether or not that's helpful feedback is kind of up to the internet.
Right.
But you get the instant gratification of knowing people have read what you have just written. And that, I think, is something that authors don't necessarily always have when they're starting out. So I think it's a training ground, and I think it's an opportunity to play, as you said, in other people's sandboxes, not having to do all of the world building yourself,
right.
Taking something that's already there and seeing what you can do with it. So you don't have to build everything from scratch. You already have the blocks. You just have to put them together in a different way.
I think a lot of would-be novelists get lost in the world-building phase because for a lot of people, like, that's the really exciting thing. They love just sitting, putting those blocks together and piecing that world together, and then they get so lost in the weeds of that when it's actually time to write a plot, they're just in a tangle and they can't get any further. And obviously there's a lot of different flavors of writers, but I know several people like that write intricate, interesting worlds, but cannot get past them in order to actually put a story together. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that writing with fanfic, it gives you all the pieces, and then you can figure out how to thread them together meaningfully in a way that's entertaining. What did you find as far as the community there? I'm not personally that familiar with like sort of the fanfic community, although I see people talk about it on Twitter and stuff sometimes. So how much feedback did you get? Did you get a following there? And do you think they'll follow you to your own original works?
I do, in fact. I wrote a very popular fic several years ago, which got me an enormous number of followers on Tumblr and an enormous number of kudos, which is like upvotes on Archive of Our Own, in very short time. That fic just took off and ran away, and even now I'm still kind of amazed at how popular it was. It is, I think, still the highest kudos in its fandom at the time. But the people who read that would then go on to read my other stuff. And the other stuff is better than that fic. It's just less popular. But that was like the way in. And so people, once they had read that, they wanted to read other things that I've written. And I got almost completely positive feedback on most of my fics, which is very nice. And I'm not expecting that in the real world, but it was really nice. And also I got a number of people saying, are you ever going to write a book? We want to read it if we do. So I know that a lot of people have actually crossed over from my fanfic into my actual writing career, which is kind of exciting.
Is it scary to make the leap as a debut author into the worlds of Amazon reviews and Goodreads and places where, the voracious and eager to critique crowd is kind of lying in wait, nefariously drumming their fingers like, ooh, there's a new one, fresh meat,
It's terrifying, and for my own mental health, I am curating how many of the reviews I actually look at. I'm very lucky to have a publicist who sends me the really good ones, which is extremely helpful. And the ones that aren't positive, I just tend to not read, because not everyone is going to like the book. Some people are going to hate the book, and that's fine. I don't need to actually make myself miserable by reading why they don't like the book. I get enough of that with fanfic. I do not need it in the real world.
Yeah, I think, there's value to good critique. Goodreads sometimes strikes me as a place that's tough because a really good chunk of the people write reviews like they're writing a high school book report, which means that they spend 3/4 of what they're writing summarizing which the other 1,000 people who reviewed the book have also done. So for me, like, you know, like going on that community, sometimes I get frustrated because I'm like, I just want to know somebody's opinion is. I want to hear like a reasoned, like, we already read the description, like get to the point of telling me like what was good or what wasn't in your view. Because it's almost, you know, it's sort of exploring things in aggregate to kind of find, like, do things get mentioned a lot? Because there are very uncritical readers that just 5-star everything that ever passes in front of their eyes. And they're great. They're a supportive audience, but they're a non-critical audience. And so their feedback isn't always exceptionally useful. And then there are people who are knee-jerk reaction, where if something doesn't hit home with them at all, they're a 1 and 2 star, like, I hate everything, you know, and they just can't wait to dole that out. You know, so I basically skip everything but 4s and 3s for the most part, unless it's somebody that I actually follow, because I feel like that's where I find people that have something to say. And because I find most things in life are not 5 stars.
It's difficult to imagine a world in which everything was 5 stars.
Right, yeah. Anytime I see a reviewer that gives 5 stars to things, I'm like, to me, 4 stars on something tells me that it is really good, it does what it intended to do, and it delivered on that promise, and it was enjoyable. 5 stars told me that it did all of that, and it cooked me dinner, and I read it 5 more times, and it made me smarter so that I sound better at parties. You know, like, it should, you know, give me that next level of something with it, beyond the expectation. And I find most things don't really do that. So, yeah.
Yeah, they don't do your taxes for you, that kind of stuff.
Right. If they did, 5 stars for sure. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Unless they did it poorly, like H&R Block does. And then maybe I would drop them right back down to 2. I want to jump back into your background for a minute. I want to find out, like, what your educational background is, and also personal background, because Strange Practice takes place in London. You live on the East Coast of the States. You have a speaking style that hints at possible other accents. You have that, like, not quite landing right where I would think you are as an American. So I'm just curious what your own personal background is.
Well, the short version is I was born in Kenya to a pair of British scientists. And they were there because my dad was doing a postdoctoral fellowship in some form of zoology. So they decided to have me while they were there. And about 18 months later, they moved back to Britain, which is where we lived. We moved around several times, but we were still in Britain. And we left in 1987 to come here to Maryland, and I have been here ever since. And I do still have the vestiges of a British accent, which is convincing to most Americans, but not at all to actual Brits. And it's profoundly embarrassing when it turns itself on when I'm reading out loud. I have to try and watch that.
Yeah, I imagine it, like, now going and doing readings, if you're doing readings for the book as you're doing the promotional tour, that's probably a real danger.
Yeah, you have to make sure you're not actually doing the voices. You're reading the book as opposed to doing the voices. If I start in one accent and I'm not really, really stressed, I can mostly stay in it all the way through. If I start talking to someone who has a strong British accent, mine will almost always surface. And it's like, I'm not trying to pretend that I'm, like, following your accent. It's just happening. I'm sorry about it. But yeah, I'm not from here. I'm not actually from anywhere because I've moved around so much. But I've lived in Baltimore, in and around Baltimore for many, many years.
Those personal histories are interesting, you know, because, you know, even though you've been in the States most of your life then, you did have exposures to other places. And I think those things seed the imagination. You know, they give you a little something extra. So, you know, in writing a story about London then, how do you handle the research and trying, because it feels very vivid. It feels very authentic. There hasn't been any point where I felt like, you know, you were half-assing it. Like, it felt legit. So how much of that is research? Did you go back over? Did you explore? Like, what went into that?
I'm glad you asked. One of the things I love most about writing is getting to do the research. I have to do all of the research. I will not write a thing unless I'm fairly confident that I know what I'm talking about. So the way I did Strange Practice is I spent a very great time on Google Street View. I followed where my characters would have walked along the map and figured out what they would have seen, so that I could describe it accurately at any given time. I looked at God knows how many multi-layered sets of pictures of different parts of London. I spent a long time on urban exploration sites. It was subbrit.com that showed me the Mercury Arc rectifier for the first time. And that was one of the things back in 2004 that had inspired the novel. Mostly what I would do is I would be writing, and if I came to put a detail in and I wasn't entirely sure what I was talking about, I would immediately stop and go and open about 3 browser tabs and start looking it up. because that's the one thing that will throw me out of a story other than poor grammar, is people who don't do the research or who do enough to get to just where they want to be and not any further. So they're categorically wrong about the thing and they don't know or care, and it's just, I can't deal with that.
Like a lot of fan fiction stuff, at least the little bits that I've read of it, has felt riddled with that. Mostly because they were written quickly and for fun. But even like in TV shows, sometimes I'll see a show obviously shot in Atlanta or LA or Vancouver, and they'll be like, here you are in St. Louis, where I'm from. They're like, we're in St. Louis, like Supernatural. It's been in St. Louis a few times. And it's a St. Louis, and I'm like, we don't have anything that looks like that. Like, that is not us at all. Like, I know that you tried to make a believable neighborhood, but there's literally no place here that looks anything like that. And, you know, it can pull you right out of a scene. But it seems only like when you're actually a person in that place that you notice that. And probably 99% of viewers or readers don't pick up on that stuff. But it does ground things better when you've actually made the effort. And so it feels more real.
Yeah, it feels more natural. And the references that you make and the way you describe things just flow much more naturally. As opposed to, I am talking about this thing that I don't necessarily understand all the way, but I'm pretending that I do. It always seems kind of awkward when people write from that standpoint.
I would say too that like the language of the novel, like again, like I've said, like there's a very specific kind of feel and flow to it that feels original and yet, you know, has that referential kind of element to it. Not in the pop referential, but in the classically referential. But I've also noticed there's a lot of really interesting words that me, with a pretty large vocabulary, I find myself looking things up fairly frequently too. And I like that. I enjoy a good quarter word here and there. And I'm just curious, like, if that's something that, if you're kind of pulling words that you found, like, specifically in some of the older texts and some of those vampire stories or, you know, those older stories, and you're kind of making that part of that world, or if it's just that you're like, Ruthven's been around for several hundred years and he's very cultured, so he's going to talk highfalutin, that kind of thing.
It's definitely the latter. Also, I love words. I also love it when a book makes me look something up, because then I will have learned a thing and I knew something more than I did before I picked the book up. I love words, and I know a lot of words, and I love using the $10 words. So if I have an opportunity to do that, like with a character such as Ruthven, who has been around for 400 something years and has seen many things, I love being able to slot those words in and have them actually make sense in context.
There was one that Fast, and I say Fast, and I think the whole name, I'm going to totally butcher this, is like, I can't even do it. Can you give Fastacolons?
Fastatocolon.
No.
Fastatocolon. I stole it from Tolkien. I stole it right out of Tom Bombadil.
Yeah.
There's a poem that starts, so this is Fastatocolon, an island good to land upon, although 'tis rather bare. And the Fastatocolon in that story is a giant sea turtle who likes to wait for people to land on the shell, and then he sinks, drowning them, because apparently that's how he gets his kicks. But I love the name, so I stole it. And I think Tolkien stole it from somewhere too, but that's my excuse for using that name.
Well, Tolkien is in the rich literary tradition of grabbing a few things that were out there in the ether and pulling them in and shifting a vowel here and there and calling it something new. So, yeah, it's a quality tradition, and we should keep up with it. But there was one point where he's talking about his flat and the people that he lives near and the racket that he makes coughing and that the racket that the people around him makes. And I cannot think of the word off the top of my head, but it was like...
Obstreperous.
Yes, that's the one.
Obstreperous landlords. Obstreperous upstairs neighbors, I think was the phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. It's the kind of word that Fass would use. He has that kind of almost didactic vocabulary, which he really loves using. And he also, at times, can speak extremely colloquially. And I like putting those two together in conversation because it always gives more sort of dynamic interest to the way a character speaks if they blend more than one thing.
There's an interesting passage where he's with August Cranswell, who is the totally human museum curator that they're working with, and they're sneaking back into the museum, and you have Fass's particular kind of speech pattern of his mind, but then he's also sort of touching on August's mind, and I remember like he drops the F-bomb somewhere in there, and I had that moment of being like, whoa, I think that's the first actual swear in the book. And I am not sure if that was or not, but I thought it was a very interesting moment because it's like he's touching on August, who is a younger man and an American living in... Is he an American living in London?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, well, that makes perfect sense because he's in that contact with somebody else's mind. And it amused me. Again, it made me laugh. And I was like, the book has made me laugh several times without like seemingly written to be humorous, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, and I liked that there were several places that I found super amusing, along with being creepy and interesting. So it's super fun. I also noted while I was doing the prerequisite stalking of you, is that is that you're a cosplayer.
Yes.
You know, that's an interesting thing, because I have oddly recently discovered in a lot of my convention going, because we do a lot of Comic Cons and stuff, I've met a lot of authors who also do cosplay. Many of who often live in the weird zone of trying to figure out, is it okay to cosplay and try to sell my books at the same time? Because that is a delicate balance. And I often tell new writers, I'm like, maybe hold off on that for a little while, because some people have a hard time figuring out how to take you seriously if you're dressed as an elf and you're selling a book about elves or something like that. But at the same time, cosplay is awesome. And I saw you had one that was like a Emperor Hux. I say Emperor in quotation marks, because a very regal Hux from the New Order from Force Awakens, and a really, really impressive Furiosa outfit as well. That was really, particularly that arm. Oh my God. It looked incredible. So how long have you been doing that? And how do you fit that into everything else you're doing?
I've probably been cosplaying since about 2012. And it's like all of these things, it starts very small and snowballs quickly into more and more ambitious ideas. And I think the Furiosa arm is the most impressive prop I have ever made. And it comes off in 3 parts. The harness with the belts around the ribs and the shoulder part comes off. Then the hand itself and the forearm are separate. So you can take the whole thing off in bits, which is extremely handy during conventions if you happen to need to go to the bathroom or wash your hands or whatever. And it's so comfortable. It does not look comfortable at all, and it really, really is. I love characters that I can cosplay with my natural hair, so I don't have to wear wigs. And I have very, very short hair, so Furiosa just felt perfectly right. It was like, oh, look, a character who has my haircut.
The Hux one looked like you had dyed it red, because you're like looking at it here, it's very bright white, at least in the lighting of the room. And so you had it red, and I was struck that I was like, wow, you looked dead on.
Gleason, Donald Gleason.
Donald Gleason, yeah. It was like there was that moment of saying like, oh my gosh, like that's a perfect pick there. It was pretty spot on.
Hux is definitely my favorite that I've ever cosplayed. It was not this past Katsucon, but the one before that I first did Hux. And it was largely a last-minute decision to do it. And the only things that were difficult were fixing the tunic and finding the coat. But it felt so natural. It felt completely natural and absolutely delightful to just stalk through the con with the coat over my shoulders and just feel like, okay, I am in charge. But Hux is great, and we hope to get some more pictures back from this year's Katsucon. There are a lot more of that Emperor Hux and Knight Kylo Ren, who was my fellow cosplayer who was with me in that shot. And I'm really looking forward to those, because I think they're going to be kind of impressive.
Well, the outfit design was awesome, and you pulled off the regal bearing very, very well. Your profile photo, like on Twitter, you look very stately. You're staring off into the middle distance, and like it looks like something that you'd put on a dollar bill or something. You have that countenance.
So that picture, the author picture, which is basically the author picture across the internet, is in fact a cosplay shot. I am dressed up as a Star Wars villain. But that was one of my favorite pictures anyone has ever taken of me, so I was extremely glad that I could use it for something more mainstream. But yeah, that's what that is.
It's the beauty of the crop.
Yep.
Well, it's awesome. I like that. So Strange Practice is coming out July 25th. So what is your like world tour like? Now as a debut author, like usually there's like the dog and pony show of putting you out in front of as many people as possible to spread the word and build fans and stuff like that. So how is that affecting your normal life as well?
Well, actually, and somewhat fortunately, that hasn't really happened. I did do a signing at BookCon a couple weeks ago. That was great. That was signing advanced reader copies of the book, not the book itself, because it still hadn't come back from the printers yet. But there were a huge line of people just waiting to have the book signed who had never read any of it. So my publicity team is doing a fantastic job. But I don't have any tours scheduled That may change if the book actually does really well, but right now I don't think I have to fly anywhere and be on any shows or anything like that. That's for the next book, maybe.
Yeah, it's going to happen. I feel pretty strongly that this book will do well because, like I said, a quarter of the way through, I'm very much enjoying it, and I think that you have a distinctive voice, and I think you've got a great team at Orbit, all the way around, putting it out there, and you're in illustrious company with the people that are in that line, so it's sharp. With that coming out and all these other things that you're doing, do you find a lot of time to consume other books and TV and stuff? And if so, what are you feeding your brain with right now?
Unfortunately, I really haven't had the time to explore anything new. What I do for fun is read books that I already know. I have almost the entire Terry Pratchett collection, and they're like mind candy. When I need to decompress and stop doing anything, I need to treat my brain, so I go and I reread one of Pratchett's novels. And I don't have the wherewithal right now to devote to exploring a whole new world. I would love to, but writing the second book is taking up most of my time and brain right now. So I'm looking forward to having that draft in so that I can decompress for a couple weeks and maybe read some other people's books after a change.
The Greta Helsing stories, that's intended as a trilogy, right?
Yes,
at least initially.
That's correct.
And, a thing I forgot to get into is the nuts and bolts of what are you actually writing in? What software, what's your style?
Google Docs. I work in Google Docs because it works anywhere there is internet, and I don't have to rely on a particular hard drive going south. I will download things and make backups, and I need to get a much better external hard drive, but almost everything I do is cloud-based. It's Google Docs. And that means I can share it very easily to some of my readers who look at the thing before I send it to anyone else. I have preliminary readers. And it's so convenient, and it saves automatically. I do not use Word except for at work, basically.
Are you an outliner, a pantser, a combination of one or the other?
A hybrid, I think. I kind of prefer the George R. Martin, are you an architect or a gardener taxonomy of writers.
Interesting.
You like that? Yeah, I like that one better. And again, it's a little bit of both. I generally I have the outline. I know what happens in the plot, and I have the outline of this happens in this chapter, or this is what happens in this next scene. Then how I actually get there is kind of seat of pants. I'll start writing, and either it will take off and I'll get to the end of the scene and be like, yay, I want to write more. Or it will be like pulling teeth, and I look back at my word count and say, I will fix this later. It varies based on the scene and my own mental state, the world around me, what time I have to write, that kind of thing.
Are you a late night writer, a daytime person, sneaking it in on lunch breaks? Where do you get it done? Yeah,
basically all of the above. I do write during the day, but I do some of my best work very late at night.
I think that when you talk, you're describing moody, dark London, probably a little midnight writing is helpful for that.
It doesn't hurt, yeah.
Yeah. I feel like the environment seeps into the things that we're doing. It's sometimes very difficult to write a creepy scene when you're sitting on a bright, sunshiny day with the birds singing around you. I think some people can make that leap. To me, there's a mental disconnect there that can make that challenging.
Yeah, you have to pull the blinds, turn the lights off, maybe put on some Mozart, that kind of thing, just get your head in the groove.
So how far are we away from that second novel?
The second novel should, if all goes well and everything's on track, it should come out next summer.
Okay, so a nice year in between, which I think is a solid turnaround time. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Vivian, I really have enjoyed talking to you. I really am liking Strange Practice. I'm looking forward to finishing up. It's one of those kind of books that I would probably sit down and devour very quickly if I was reading in more than 30-minute blocks, which is the way my life works right now. So I totally understand the things you're talking about because it's so hard to juggle that. But I think it's an interesting premise. It's a great character. It's a great world. And I'm looking forward to finishing it and moving on to that second one in a year from now or so. Just so briefly tell us where people should find you, your work, and how to follow and stay up to date with you.
Well, I am on Twitter as Cerulean Cynic. Cerulean like the color blue, Cynic, all one word. I am on Tumblr, as you well know. And I have two Tumblrs. I have the author Tumblr, where I do stuff that's only related to the book series. And then I have the personal Tumblr, which has silly memes in it and pictures of Star Wars characters. I don't have an Instagram yet, and largely my presence on the web is Tumblr, Twitter, and AO3, Archive of Our Own, which is where all my fanfic is.
We'll make sure that everybody goes and discovers that fun stuff. I believe that your Tumblr actually has like the first 2 or 3 chapters of Strange Practice on it as well. So if people want to go and get a little taste of the good stuff before they commit to it, then it is there and waiting for them.
Yeah, Orbit has actually posted. It's really cool. They posted the first 4 chapters, one a week for the past 4 weeks. The 4th chapter just came out today. And I still haven't got around to reblogging it because I've been doing this. But as soon as I can, I will reblog that to my author Tumblr and to my regular Tumblr. So all of my followers, because I have many more on the personal than the author blog, many people can actually see it. I'm really excited that they're doing that. I love the get a sneak preview, see if you want to buy the book, and then you won't be disappointed if you do. And then you can pre-order it because the links are all in the posts.
Well, Vivian, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for joining us on Fictitious, and really look forward to seeing where your career heads next.
Thank you very much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Fictitious. Strange Practice by Vivian Shaw and published by Orbit Books arrived in stores and online on July 25th. I just spotted it on my local Barnes & Noble's featured new releases display, so go and grab your copy now. It's a terrific novel. The home for Fictitious and all of the Nerd for a Living family of podcasts is nerdforaliving.com. Go there for our full archive of episodes, sign up for our mailing list, or send us a message with your feedback. We'd love to hear from you. Fictitious is on Twitter as @FictitiousPod, which is a great way to keep up with updates from the show, plus genre, writery news, and discussions. And I'd always love to hear from you too, so come tell me whatever you're reading and writing on Twitter as well, where I'm @AdrianBusky. Keep getting new episodes of Fictitious by subscribing to us on Apple Podcasts or Google Play, and you can support the show by writing us a review. Ratings and reviews help other listeners discover our show, and they help us bring you more great conversations with exciting writers and creators. This podcast is produced by Wendy Busky, with sound designed by me, Adrian Busky. Fictitious and the Nerd for a Living family of podcasts for the ambitious geek are a production of Armadian Media and Entertainment. Now then, author friends, get back to writing.